Hello and welcome to our commentary on The Chosen. I'm Dr. Scott Hefelfinger, joined by Dr. Michael Barber, my friend and colleague here at the Augustine Institute. Today we are looking at The Chosen Season 3, Episode 6, which has the title, Intensity in Tent City. The perfect title for Dr. Barber, since he is a lover of puns. I just had to say that. So here we go. So there's a lot going on in this episode, and just, to be upfront about it, I kind of have mixed feelings. I find some things at this point, right, are a little confusing. Not yet sure what some of these things add. So we've seen a lot of various sorts of tensions, for example, between Peter and Eden, his wife. And here it kind of comes to a head in a scene that is a sad scene, but also beautiful. And we don't learn in this scene, but it comes into the light sort of fully that Eden had a miscarriage. And this presentation, of something that has affected and will continue to affect many people, I thought it was a very welcome portrayal of human suffering, and even this acknowledgement actually of the loss of life or a baby is, a kind of welcome and beautiful pro-life message. And what stood out in my mind was just seeing, if I remember correctly, Peter is just kind of on his knees on the floor, and Eden is kind of comforting him. And to just see this vulnerability and to acknowledge something that often remains hidden and is a source of great suffering for many couples. So that was a beautiful presentation, I thought. And I don't want to not acknowledge that. It was very beautiful. The one question I had, and this is what I meant by confusing, is obviously this is not in the gospel, and we've already said that's okay. They're adding some things. It's puzzling at this point how this is going to tie in. And I have no doubt that it will in some important way. And I'm kind of excited to see how it does. But at this point, it just seems like, wow, there's a lot of drama here that's extra biblical, and I don't quite see how it's going to factor in. So maybe that'll be a great surprise for me later on. But a lot going on, and that's one part of it that's a little confusing for me.
Right, and I don't want to downplay that the power of that scene because,
Right.
Again, miscarriages are common in our world today. It's something people suffer with quietly. Sometimes people feel ashamed to talk about it, and so that can inhibit healing. My wife and I have experienced the tragedy of miscarriages, and it's heartbreaking because you have your hopes on this child, and then you lose that child, and it can be very devastating. So I don't want to in any way downplay that or minimize that. But like you said, it's a major event, right? It's
exactly.
a major source of
such
sorrow.
an important and tragic thing.
Right.
That to insert it raises that question about the narrative, I think.
Right. How is this going to be done justice in the story? I'm also a little bit confused by the timeline here. Again, I don't want to be nitpicky, but we are trying to give a balanced commentary. So I need to point out that the timeline here is a little confusing to me. John says that Andrew's visit to John the Baptist took place, quote unquote, over a month ago. So sometime less than 2 months ago. So that means that Eden's miscarriage took place 2 weeks ago. And that means that in season 3, episodes 1 through 3 would have all taken place sometime about 2 to 4 weeks ago. So a lot has happened here. You've had the apostles in Capernaum and Peter and his wife thinking about planning a family. Then you have the apostles being sent out. And how long are they gone? How far do they go? They're going to Caesarea Philippi, but they're going further south than that. They're going to Samaria and other places. The Decapolis we see. And then Eden then has to learn of her pregnancy. So that would take some time for her to discover that she's been pregnant. And then she would have to suffer the miscarriage. And then the apostles return. So there's a lot going on. It's kind of squeezed in here. So I'm just trying to figure out how all of that can take place in the time frame. I'll be interested to see how the other episodes unfold and what chronological markers we get for some of these things here, I expect we'll see some indication that more time must have elapsed than what's just communicated here. But
So,
yeah.
I mean, so these, I think for both of us, these were a little confusing. Like the complexity can be enriching. This was a little more on the confusing side, I think, for us. But let's go to the enriching side. There were other things in the kind of a lot going on business that were, I think, very helpful. At least I found them really helpful. And a couple of examples just to kind of show that a lot going on has to do with a political and social kind of complexity. And I think we could start with a Roman sort of dimension to this. The opening scene, actually, of this episode draws us immediately into this Roman dimension of the complexity. So let's take a quick look at this clip.
So here we have a scene of the apostles asleep. We have a scene of Jesus praying, and then he looks like he's been emotional. He's been disturbed. Something heavy is happening. It seems pretty obvious that this is a depiction of the agony in the garden scene right after the Last Supper. And of course, that serpent weaving its way through the garden, it would remind us, I think, especially of the Passion of the Christ, where Mel Gibson depicted the story of, or the scene of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane with a similar image of a snake. It reminds us of a passage from the Old Testament that's long been cited in the church's tradition as the first gospel, the first announcement of the gospel, Genesis chapter 3, verse 3:15. If we can go to the slides here, guys, we read, the Lord says, "I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." And so here we have a passage that points to the defeat of the serpent's offspring and the serpent himself. And that's long been interpreted in the tradition messianically as a prophecy about the coming of Christ. Now,
yeah, and this character too is very interesting. This Pilate's wife, called Claudia here, I think.
I can't remember. Did they give her a name or not? Because there are two names in the tradition for her: Procula and Claudius. Yeah, or Claudia.
So it's fascinating that she, of course, later in the Gospels has a dream and sort of warns Pilate, and because of that little datum in the Gospel, she's actually venerated in the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches as a saint, as having had a conversion and coming to sainthood. So interesting character. And so she's arguing with her husband about all the killing and why crucifixion so early in the morning. And so we see some of this, again, this Roman dimension going on. And another side of it is this interesting kind of power struggle, or it's not a love triangle, it's almost a hate triangle between the praetor, Quintus, right, and Pilate, and you have Atticus kind of in the middle maneuvering. Gaius is involved in a different way, and so lots of interesting kind of Roman intrigue and complexity there, which I think is very fitting in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and it does help us think about what was Pilate's place in the ancient world here. Pilate says that Judea would have been viewed as a bad assignment That may have been the case. We don't really know for sure. We hear here that Pilate really wants there to be peace in the scene. Praetor wants Gaius to just kill Jesus, and he knows he can't. Right. And that's pretty common, right? The Romans want to just act, and they want to just put down any threat, and they want to use force. And that seems to have been something Pilate was known for. But at the same time, Pilate has one of the longest terms as governor, procurator in Judea. And under him, Caiaphas is high priest for a very long time, according to history. And so Pilate is an interesting man to look at from a historical perspective. And so filmmakers always have take a lot of delight, I think, in playing with what we know about Pilate and trying to get into his head here. Of course, the praetor wants guys to just destroy the whole tent city and get rid of all these people. And those kinds of actions would have brought about a reaction from the Jews, and it ends up getting Pilate reprimanded, not in the Gospels, but we know this from history. So yeah, it's complicated.
And when he orders Gaius to do that, I really liked in The Chosen how Gaius's response is, I know what I have to do.
Right.
And we begin to see, if there was doubt, we begin to see very clearly that there's a change that's happened and is ongoing in Gaius. We'll come back to that. But, so lots going on in this kind of Roman world, which is fascinating and I think very enriching. Let's switch over to the kind of Greek world that's also in play here. And let's just begin with another clip that we've got.
The consequences of your mission were disastrous.
Consequences?
The Decapolis is mostly Hellenist, but it's also a melting pot. Jews, Romans, Seleucids, Arabians.
Oh, sounds messy.
It is. It's already barely holding it together. Your preaching made it... The town is on fire. I mean, not really on fire. Some places.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. We only preach to
It
Jews.
doesn't matter who you were there for. A few Greeks overheard, some Jews kept sharing what you said. Before you know it, a few Greeks quit worshipping Olympian gods or stopped reading the auspices. That made people angry, so they turned on the Jews. The Jews closed ranks and sent the Hellenists and sympathizers out of their communities.
Oh, man. You guys really turned the place upside down.
All right, I really enjoyed this scene as Leander's explaining that now Greeks, Gentiles, are starting to worship the God of Israel. And you can see some of the apostles going like this. Oh boy, this is going to be complicated.
Talking to them.
Yeah, and it is going to be very complicated, right? Because Jews were given special exemptions. If you were part of the Roman Empire, it was understood that you were going to worship the Roman gods. But they came to understand Jews aren't going to go along with this. So let's give them a little bit of an exemption here and not expect them to be as polytheistic, like everybody else is. And we actually have sources that tell us in the ancient world about how Jews were perceived. Tacitus is an ancient writer, and he talks about the dangers of Gentiles, of Romans converting to a Jewish way of life. And he says this. We can go to the slide here, guys. He says, those who are converted to their ways, Jewish ways, follow the same practice. And the earliest lesson they receive is to despise the gods, to disown their country, and to regard their parents, children, and brothers as of little account. However, they take thought to increase their numbers, for they regard it as a crime to kill any late-born child. And they believe that the souls of those who are killed in battle or by the executioner are immortal. Hence comes their passion for begetting children and their scorn of death. So Tacitus is here saying people who convert to Jewish lifestyles are bad for our society. They're going to be bad soldiers because they're going to think it's okay to die. They're going to want to keep people alive who shouldn't be kept alive. Of course, Romans would practice abortion, and this was something that killing children, especially those who are, as he says, they're late born, this would have been appalling for Jews. So so here we see Tacitus being very concerned, and one of the big issues is they disregard their gods, right? They disregard their own gods. This is a major problem. How do we have crops grow? How do we keep plagues away? How do we make sure the weather is stable? Well, we appeal to the gods, and if you're going to disregard the gods, you're going to bring down all kinds of chaos on us, right? And so this becomes an issue in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, Paul is preaching in Ephesus, and many people begin to embrace his message. And there's a man who is in the city who's very concerned about this, and he explains this. Now we go back to the slides. This is Acts 19. He says, there is a danger not only that this trade of ours maybe go into disrepute, excuse me, this idea of being a silversmith, building gods and idols, right? But also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be scorned. That's what Ephesus was most known for. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, this great temple. And she will be deprived of her majesty that brought all Asia in the world to worship her. Look, this is bad for tourism, guys. We're going to start worshiping the God of Israel, Isaac, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what's going to happen? Well, people are going to end up scorning this amazing temple that's at the heart of our economy, right? And so this issue that we see presented in The Chosen is actually a real world issue. And I have to say, I cracked up when I saw the apostles in the scene put their hands up like, oh boy, what's happening? Because you understand, the Romans might then say, wait a minute. Now everybody wants this exemption that the Jews get. We're going to have to rethink this. And that could be a major problem. So it's especially Judeans, especially Jews in the book of Acts, who get really nervous when Gentiles start worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not all, but there are some.
One thing I just had in the kind of discipleship line of thought was this idea that they sort of went out there, they preached their thing,
Yeah.
and then they learn like, actually, it got really messy. It was like dropping a bomb here.
Right.
And, sometimes I think we're tempted to think, in our conversations with others or evangelization, it's like, I'm just going to deliver that like silver bullet of a line. My work here is finished.
Right.
But often it's not. There's follow-up that's required. And so
Right.
they get their things together and they're getting ready to head back down because it's not always and maybe often not once and done. So that work of discipleship is a work of continued effort, right, and repeated efforts, I think. So that was a great scene, again, just to bring out like, wow, this is complicated with the Greeks and worshiping and the institution of polytheism and its political ramifications. So there's that. So all this is going on, and we see the apostles. So there's an apostolic dimension to all that's going on here too. They're just not always sure how to react to these complex situations, and the scene we just saw is one of them, but there's another one, right, where we see they're preparing weapons. It's like, wow, didn't expect that. So let's take a look at that in a clip.
I can see that you are sharpening weapons, but why?
Some of us are worried, Matthew. Things are becoming serious. More people have heard. I mean, you were there when he healed the bleeding woman.
Of course, I wrote it all down. But I did not see what happened in the house.
I said I'll give you the details
I
later.
don't want you to forget.
I told you. I won't forget.
Crowds were pushing in. A hobbling woman was able to grab at him.
Only the fringe of his garment, James.
The power went out of him without his consent.
It looked like he was gut punched.
We didn't say that it hurt.
No, it just looked like it.
If we had had blades, we could have hurt her.
Might have had to.
So one thing that's interesting about this scene is they're fashioning weapons, and you can see they're actually using daggers. And we've talked about the zealots. Josephus talks about the zealots in the lead up to the Jewish war. And the zealots were also often associated with the daggermen, right? So if Z is Simon the Zealot here, and he's being portrayed as part of this group, and I've mentioned there's some anachronistic issues here, but some historical concerns, but it would make sense that they're using daggers. That's what a zealot might help the other apostles use as a weapon. But there are interesting conversations taking place. There are so many interesting things that are said. I like how James says, okay, the power went out from Jesus without his consent. And I do like that dimension of the story of the healing of the woman with the hemorrhage, right? That she's leaking blood and Jesus is leaking healing power. You know, there's sort of a contrast between the two there. And then, of course, what James mentions that this woman was healed by Jesus, and he's trying to figure out, well, did Jesus intend to do that? What happened? And Philip says, well, look, you know, if we were doing better crowd control like some of you want us to do, this woman never would have been healed.
Yeah, so there's a lot of confusion here. And the one thing, I mean, it did surprise me to see them sharpening weapons, but it also highlighted to me much later in the gospel when Peter draws a sword.
Yes.
It's kind of like, where did that come from? I mean, why is a fisherman carrying a sword around? And so this actually, of course, is not in the gospel, but it does provide some connective tissue there to see like why it is that perhaps later on Peter will be carrying a sword or an instrument of some sort like that.
Yeah, well, actually, there are different passages that seem to sort of be in tension with one another in the Gospels, right? Jesus says in Matthew 10, do not think that I have come to cast peace upon the earth. I've come not to cast peace, but a sword. And in context, he talks about how their family members will be turned against one another, which is what's happening up in the Decapolis, right? But then Jesus also says in Matthew 26, put your sword back in its place, for all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. And so when Jesus says in Matthew 10, he comes to bring a sword, it probably doesn't mean he comes to bring an actual sword, right? And so he's actually telling the apostles not to have a sword. And then in Luke's gospel, in Luke 22, Jesus says, whoever has no sword, let him sell his cloak and buy one.
Right.
So now there are ways in the tradition that all these passages are understood as making specific points in their own context. But let's just talk at a real basic level here. Jesus made all of these different kinds of comments. And so the depiction of the apostles sort of trying to figure out what exactly is going on makes sense with even just the data we have. And the thing that we see here in the story is there's a misunderstanding about, well, how are we supposed to protect Jesus? Are we supposed to help spread his message? What's the priority? And I especially like how Gaius gets brought up. And, you know, some of them are very concerned about this Roman getting too close. Peter is friends with getting to be too close with Gaius. Matthew says, well, he's not an evil man. I thought that was a very interesting detail to have Matthew add that detail. Well, you know, I actually know the man.
Yeah.
There's more to him than you might realize. Interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So we have all of these different kind of places of complexity that we've highlighted. Yeah. And one thing I really liked about the narrative arc of this episode is how it kind of comes together in a culminating scene where Jesus is healing people and he's confronted in a way by John the Baptist's disciples, and a couple of the Pharisees are there. The Zealots are in the background. Gaius is looking out. So all of it comes together, and we've tried to piece some of that together in a little clip for you. So let's take a look at that.
We heard our former comrades Andrew and Philip have gone to the Decapolis. Is that where you're planning to launch the revolution to overthrow Rome?
I have something in mind for the Decapolis, and it will be revolutionary, but probably not in the way you're thinking.
What are we supposed to report back?
Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. The lepers are cleansed. The mute speak. And the poor have the good news preached to them. Blessed is the one who is not offended by me.
I will always be offended by blasphemy. As should all of you!
So what happened to his daughter? You know this isn't blasphemy.
I did not see what happened. Your supposed rabbi disrespected me as a holy man. Another sign of his evil spirit. And I also don't know any of the details that happened. He is hiding something. And I cannot stand here and allow you all to be deceived by his sorcery. Even if I'm the only one willing to protect you.
Go. Relay to my cousin what you have seen and heard here today. And add to that the dead are raised as well. And tell John I love him.
So what I love about this is the numerous different audiences all gathered together in one place. And what comes out so well is that we have, an account of Jesus' words in the gospel, but it doesn't always show us the intended audience, right? And so the Chosen has taken some liberties here in defining those audiences for us. And we might have some questions about how Jesus targets certain phrases. I'll probably raise one later. But I really like that it makes us think, there was a lot going on. Jesus' words had intended meanings probably for different audiences and were picked up in different ways by different people. And this way of teaching to, various audiences actually, in my mind, highlighted how much sense it makes that Jesus has an inner circle, that he has the chosen, that he has apostles who in the Catholic tradition end up having apostolic authority, because just from the text, we don't always know the meaning of the teaching, and we have to kind of sort through that with the reflection that the church carries out through tradition in her teaching office. So that was one of my favorite things about this scene, was the many different audiences and reactions to Jesus' words.
Yeah, let's look at that story in the Gospels where the disciples of John come to Jesus. Now, in the Chosen's depiction, Jesus says, well, John already has doubts, right? But he actually doesn't say that in any of the Gospel versions. Somebody might say, well, that's implied. But let's take a look at the story just so we can get grounded in the biblical account itself. I want to look at the Matthean version. So if we can go to the slide here, guys, we read, now when John heard in prison about the works of the Christ, he sent word through his disciples and said to him, are you the one who is to come, or shall we wait for another? And Jesus answered and said to them, go tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel proclaimed to them. We can come off the slide there for a second there. Now, what I really liked about the way the Chosen presented this is you had just seen Jesus perform these miracles, right? And I did like in the Chosen, Jesus add to that the dead are raised, which is a reference to what happened with Jairus, right? And so in the story in the Gospel of Matthew, we have the dead raised, and that's really interesting that the dead are raised. And we have another detail here, the lepers are cleansed. What is Jesus doing in the gospel itself, in the gospel story? Well, he's drawing together two biblical prophecies in particular. He's drawing together, you could look at different texts, but two in particular he seems to be drawing together are found in Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61. So let's go back to the slide here. In Isaiah 35, we have a prophecy about the future day when God restores his people. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the eyes of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing for joy. So we see that in Isaiah 35. And then Jesus also seems to be drawing on Isaiah 61, where we read, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. So here we have an anointed figure, anointed one, Messiah, Meshiach is anointed one, Christos is the Greek version of that. So it's a messianic prophecy, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Lord has anointed me to bring good tidings to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound. Now, the thing that's really fascinating here is Jesus brings together these two passages, and he's explaining that he's bringing them to fulfillment. Now, one thing that is mentioned in Isaiah 61 is liberty to captives. But Jesus doesn't cite that line, which would have been of a special interest to a man captive in prison, right? Isaiah says, I've been anointed to proclaim liberty to the prisoners, right? And so what Jesus seems to be suggesting is that, yes, he's doing all of these works, but John is not going to get out of prison, right? Now, the dead are raised. That's good news for John, because it's not going to end well for John. And Jesus would seem to be aware of that in the story. Now, Thomas Aquinas reflected on this passage long ago, and he said that what was going on was John wasn't harboring doubts, but John wanted to send his disciples who were having doubts because he hadn't gotten out of prison yet. If you're the Messiah, why hasn't our teacher been delivered out of prison? Well, go and look. All these miracles are real, but you're going to need to have faith that what is happening here is truly the work of God, but maybe in a way you don't understand yet.
One of the things, there's a great German theologian, Romano Guardini, and in his book, The Lord, he talks about this passage, and he looks at the line at the end that Jesus adds, basically, and blessed is the one who takes no offense at me. And Guardini says that this is like a special delivery for John, who is having questions in prison. Whether or not it's John or his disciples, according to Aquinas, this line could point at either of those groups. But what happens in this scene, actually, is that this line is directed toward a Pharisee.
Right.
And I get what they're doing, but I missed the fact, or that is, I wanted to see actually this being directed towards John. Instead, we get a little bit of an anodyne sort of, and tell John I love him.
Right, exactly.
Which is great. I mean, of course, Jesus does, but I think there's a more challenging word that a profound and charismatic figure like John would have actually taken well, or his disciples would have learned from. So, but still, it's a fascinating scene there.
All right, let's talk about Gaius a little bit here.
Yeah, so we see, Gaius has this ongoing transformation. After he's instructed to destroy Tent City, he says, I know what I have to do, and he goes. And the next thing that we see him doing is actually helping out in Tent City. He's trying to help people set up their homes and take care of things. And then towards the end, after this culminating scene that we've just taken a look at, he's actually helping to disperse the crowds for Jesus' sake. And so it'll be fascinating to see what the chosen producers have planned here. But what I like is that Matthew early on, right, and Peter through this friendship are clearly playing a role in Gaius's life. It's not just sort of Jesus walks in and without any help or anything else transforms this centurion, but it's really through that the help, the instrumental kind of role played by Matthew and Peter. And this is, how evangelization works, is that we, through God's grace, we help to bring people to Christ. And so I like how this is unfolding.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see if we get into the book of Acts, or the material from Acts shows up in The Chosen, if the centurion Cornelius, if that figure is somehow friends with Gaius, or because that Peter-Cornelius connection is really strong. The Peter centurion in the gospel story doesn't seem to be strong. So I want to see how they tie that together. Now, we also have a transformation in Z here in his portrayal. And what I appreciated about the scene was where his friends declare that he is dead, that he really has died a death. And of course, that is important for Paul and other writers in the New Testament, that in Christ, conversion involves a death to self. And so Z has died to the person that he was. He's died to the commitments that he had, recognizing that this may have even fatal consequences for him. And in the Chosen's world, being part of this order of zealots is not something you can just walk away from, right? So,
yeah, and there too, I really liked how Z is sharing the gospel through deed and word. So he doesn't defend himself. He shows that he doesn't have his dagger, right?
Right.
He's ready to give his life, but he explains to them how actually Jesus healed his brother and fulfills everything that the order stands for. And he poses that as a challenge to them. So I think there's a lot there that could be said.
And that loops back to the scene that we saw earlier where they started off by sharpening their weapons. And now he doesn't have a weapon. Now he doesn't have it, exactly.
So
that's significant. So he's recognizing that to spread the gospel is going to have to do this without force, without violence. Last thing, we have Barnaby. And Barnaby witnesses Shula's healing. And then, of course, Barnaby himself is healed.
Yeah, this I thought was actually really, really beautiful because, first of all, Shula has this great humility that she doesn't need to be healed. It's not that important. She witnessed Mary Magdalene's miracle, and that's good enough for her faith, for her love. So she's not in it for herself. She just loves Jesus. But Barnaby is such a friend that he wants healing for her. And we see then after she's healed, he's not interested. Like this is not about
This
me.
is about me. Yeah,
this is about
her.
her. And that's such a model of friendship that I thought was so beautiful there. But then in his generosity and his mercy, Jesus ends up healing Barnaby.
Right.
And there's this great look on Jesus's face when Barnaby realizes it, and Jesus says something like, there it is, and there's this kind of delight, this human delight that Jesus takes in performing that miracle. And it reminded me of, we talk about the most sacred heart of Jesus and how he has a human love. He has a divine love, but he also has a human love for each and every one of us. And I thought, of course, he would take this human delight in the miracles he was able to perform there. And just a last part that I thought was really, really well done actually is we saw in an earlier episode how Jesus talks to little James about not healing him. And the way it's presented, we end up thinking that's actually very beautiful because now he can give a greater testimony to love. At the end of this episode, we see Jesus choosing to heal someone, and we think that is very beautiful. What a sign of love. And I think we talked about this a little bit earlier on of how the mystery of evil is in some ways impenetrable. We can't explain why things happen, only that Jesus is there with us as they happen. And I think it's masterful actually how The Chosen gives us a sort of almost divine vantage point where we can celebrate little James's not being healed and see the beauty of that. And we can celebrate Shula and Barnaby's being healed and see the beauty in that. And that, I think, is the proper reaction to both the mystery of evil and to God's work in restoring some, but not all, of those evil things to goodness.
My question is Barnaby Barnabas? Now, in the book of Acts, Barnabas is a Levite, and so we haven't had any indication that Barnaby is a Levite, but perhaps we'll find out that Barnaby has a cousin, as we read about in the New Testament, named Mark, who, according to Colossians, is a physician. And so he would be very interested in, Luke is the physician, but Mark would have still been the one who would have been writing these things down. So will Mark feature as Barnabas's cousin in the story? We shall see.
So to be continued on that question and in our commentary. So thank you for joining us. We hope this leads you back to God's word and to Scripture and enriches your meditation on it. God bless you.